I wasn't supposed to send that message. It was a small mistake, a slip of the fingers, an unconscious movement that sent my words to the wrong person. The second I saw his name on my screen, something in my stomach twisted. A rush of heat crawled up my neck, an immediate and irrational panic. It was supposed to go to my friend, something casual, something unimportant, but now it sat there, blinking, waiting, in the hands of someone it was never meant for. My foster brother. I hadn't spoken to him in a while, not directly, not more than the usual pleasantries during family gatherings. And yet now, through some stupid accident, I had reopened a door that should have stayed shut. The read receipt appeared immediately. My breath hitched. I should have ignored it, turned off my phone, let the moment pass without giving it power. Instead, I watched the screen as if hypnotized, heart pounding in my ears. The message wasn't incriminating. Nothing in it suggested anything deeper than a simple exchange between acquaintances. But the fact that I had sent it to him by mistake, the fact that he was reading something that wasn't meant for his eyes, set off a strange, unsteady feeling inside me. My phone vibrated. A new message appeared. Short, simple, but heavy in a way that made my throat dry. "You didn't mean to send this to me, did you?" I exhaled slowly, fingers hovering over the keyboard. A response was necessary. The longer I waited, the stranger it would feel. I should just apologize, brush it off, pretend it was nothing. A mistake. A meaningless accident. But instead I hesitated. Seconds stretched into an eternity. My car suddenly felt suffocating, the still air too thick, the grocery bags in the passenger seat forgotten. The logical thing to do was to dismiss it. End the conversation before it even began. I forced myself to type 2 words. Wrong person. My thumb hovered over the send button. One press and it would be over. One press and I could pretend this moment never happened. But I didn't press it. Another vibration. Another message. Interesting, but what if it wasn't a mistake? My stomach flipped. A rush of something sharp and unfamiliar ran through me, leaving goosebumps in its wake. My mouth was dry, my hands suddenly unsteady. There was no reason for my body to react like this. It was just a message. A handful of words that could have meant anything or nothing at all. But I felt it. A shift, subtle but undeniable. The air between us had changed, even through the distance, even through the cold glow of a phone screen. My heart thumped against my ribs as I locked my phone and tossed it onto the passenger seat. The smart thing to do was to let it go. Ignore it. Let it fade into nothingness. That's what I told myself as I pulled out of the parking lot, as I drove home with both hands clenched around the wheel, as I stepped into the familiar quiet of my house. But I didn't delete the message. And that meant something. The scent of dinner lingered in the air. The lights were dim, the sound of the television murmuring from the living room. My husband sat on the couch, focused on his laptop, his fingers tapping rhythmically against the keys. Everything looked the same. Everything felt the same. But I wasn't the same. I dropped my purse by the door, forcing my legs to move, my expression to remain neutral. My body moved on autopilot, washing my hands, pouring a glass of water, going through the normal motions of the evening. I sat beside my husband, letting my head rest against his shoulder. His warmth was familiar, steady, something I had known for years. My fingers absently traced patterns against my thigh, my mind somewhere else, trapped in a moment I didn't want to acknowledge. Hours passed. The night settled into silence. My husband drifted to sleep, his breath deep and even. I lay awake, staring at the ceiling, my phone screen glowing in the darkness beside me. The message still sat there unanswered. Waiting. My pulse quickened as I picked it up, my thumb moving before I could stop myself. It was. Pause. My heart pounded. And then, before I could think twice, wasn't it? The response came instantly. You tell me. A quiet exhale slipped from my lips. The weight of something unspoken settled over me, pressing into my chest. I placed my phone face down on the nightstand, but the damage had already been done. I wasn't going to answer again. I wasn't going to let this turn into something more. But deep down, in a place I refused to acknowledge, I already knew the truth. This wasn't over. It had only just begun. The house was full of laughter, the clinking of glasses, the familiar hum of conversation that filled the space with warmth, but none of it reached me the way it should have. I sat at the dining table, my husband beside me, his hand resting absently on my knee, his voice blending into the background as he chatted with his brother about work, sports, something that should have mattered but didn't because my focus was elsewhere. Across the table he sat. My foster brother. The person who had once been nothing more than family, but now, after one wrong message, after one dangerous exchange, he felt like something else entirely. He looked the same. Same sharp jawline, same dark eyes that had always been familiar, same confident ease that made people naturally drawn to him. But something was different. He was quieter than usual, reserved in a way that felt intentional. He barely spoke, barely interacted, but every time I glanced up I found him looking at me. Not overtly, not in a way that anyone else would notice, but in a way that made my skin feel too tight, my pulse just a little too fast, my breath just a little too shallow. It wasn't in my head. I wasn't imagining it. He was watching me, and no matter how much I told myself to ignore it, I couldn't. The air between us had changed. I felt it. And I knew he did too. The dinner stretched on, the evening dragging in a way that felt unbearable, every second ticking by like a test of my self-control. I tried to focus on my husband's words, on my plate, on anything that could distract me from the weight of his gaze, but it was impossible. Every small movement he made, every time he lifted his glass or ran his fingers over the back of his neck, felt deliberate, like a silent challenge, like a reminder that neither of us had forgotten what happened, no matter how much we pretended otherwise. Plates were cleared, conversation shifted to the living room, and I took the opportunity to slip away. The kitchen was quiet, cooler, the air filled with the scent of leftover food and freshly brewed coffee. I needed a moment, just a second to breathe, to collect myself, to shake off whatever this was before it spiraled into something I couldn't control. But then the door swung open. I didn't need to turn around to know who it was. I felt it immediately, the shift in the air, the presence behind me that sent a slow, unsettling thrill down my spine. I kept my hands busy, reaching for a dish, pretending not to notice, but my body betrayed me. My shoulders were too tense, my movements too precise, my breath too unsteady. He didn't speak right away. He just stood there, watching, waiting, the silence between us thick with unspoken things. Finally he moved, stepping closer, just enough that I could feel the warmth of his body behind me, just enough that the space between us felt impossibly small. My fingers curled around the edge of the counter, my knuckles white from the pressure. "You've been avoiding me," he said, his voice low, quiet, meant only for me. I swallowed, forcing a calmness I didn't feel. "No, I haven't." He exhaled a quiet laugh, one that sent a slow shiver down my spine. "Right." The silence stretched again, charged, waiting for something to break it. I could still fix this. I could turn around, laugh it off, walk away. But I didn't. I stayed rooted in place, trapped in whatever this was, whatever we had become. The sound of voices from the living room felt distant, like a world separate from the one we existed in now. And then, too softly, too dangerously, he spoke again. "We both feel it, don't we?" My stomach clenched, my pulse roared in my ears, my throat went dry. I should have denied it. I should have said something, anything to end this. But my silence was an answer on its own. My husband's voice cut through the moment, calling my name from the other room. I tore myself away, gripping the counter for balance before forcing my feet to move. I didn't look back as I left the kitchen, but I didn't have to. I already knew he was still watching me. And I knew this wasn't the end. It was only getting worse. The grocery store was crowded, the usual late afternoon chaos of carts squeaking against tile floors, rushed conversations, and the distant hum of checkout scanners. I was moving through the aisles on autopilot, my thoughts elsewhere, my list half forgotten in my hand. The past few days had been a blur of avoiding glances, dodging moments that felt too charged, pretending like everything was fine when it wasn't. I told myself it was just in my head, that nothing had actually happened, that if I kept moving, kept pretending, it would all disappear. But then I turned the corner and nearly crashed into him. The impact was sudden, a quick jolt of recognition that sent my stomach plummeting before my brain could catch up. He was standing in front of me, a basket in one hand, his other shoved casually into the pocket of his jeans. His expression didn't change, not really, but there was something in his eyes. Something too knowing, too sharp, too focused. I felt my pulse stutter. My fingers tightened around the handle of my cart. I could have walked away. I should have. But my feet stayed rooted in place. "Didn't expect to see you here," he said, his voice easy, conversational, like we weren't standing on the edge of something we weren't supposed to acknowledge. I forced a smile, gripping onto normalcy like a lifeline. "Just picking up a few things." He nodded slowly, his gaze never leaving mine. The air felt too thick, the space between us too small, the sounds of the store fading into something distant and unimportant. A moment stretched, thin and fragile before he moved first, reaching past me for something on the shelf. His hand brushed against mine, a fleeting touch, nothing more than an accident. But it wasn't. The second our skin connected, my breath caught. A sharp, involuntary reaction. A slow current of something I didn't want to name. I jerked my hand back like I had been burned, but he didn't move. His fingers stayed where they were, close enough that the heat of them still lingered. "If you say no, I'll stop." His voice was quiet, almost too quiet, like a challenge and a promise all at once. My throat went dry. I should have said it. It would have been so easy. Just one word, one simple syllable, and this would be over before it could start. But I didn't say it. I didn't say anything at all. He stepped closer, the space between us vanishing in an instant, and then his mouth was on mine. It wasn't slow, wasn't hesitant. It was sharp and unplanned, a sudden collision of lips and breath and too many unspoken things crashing together at once. My fingers curled into the fabric of his jacket before I could think better of it, my entire body betraying me in real time. The world tilted. My heart pounded against my ribs. And then just as quickly we broke apart. The moment shattered like glass, jagged edges slicing through whatever thin control had been holding us together. I took a step back, then another. My pulse was a thunderstorm in my ears. His breathing was uneven, his jaw tight, his gaze locked onto mine like he was trying to decipher what the hell had just happened. I didn't wait for him to say anything. I turned and walked away, gripping the cart so tightly my knuckles ached. I didn't stop. I didn't look back. I kept moving, kept walking, kept pretending like I wasn't unraveling from the inside out. But it didn't matter how far I went. The feel of his lips was still there, burned into my skin, lingering like a brand. That night, long after the house was quiet and my husband was asleep beside me, I lay awake, staring at the ceiling, my heart still racing with the weight of something I couldn't erase. I told myself it was just a mistake, an impulse, a moment of weakness that meant nothing. I convinced myself that if I ignored it, if I buried it deep enough, it would fade into nothing. But it didn't. It followed me, clung to my skin like an imprint I couldn't wash away. His lips, his touch, the way he had looked at me after. It played on a loop in my mind, an echo I couldn't silence. I avoided him after that. Or at least I tried. I changed my routines, left the house earlier, took different routes, skipped family gatherings when I could, anything to put distance between us. But it didn't matter. He was always there. Always close. Always watching. I'd turn a corner and see him standing just a few feet away, leaning against a doorway, arms crossed over his chest like he was waiting for me to acknowledge him. I'd be in the middle of a conversation and feel his gaze settle on me, heavy, unwavering, making my pulse skitter in my throat. At first, I told myself it was a coincidence. But it wasn't. I knew it. And worse, he knew I knew. My husband didn't notice at first. Or maybe he just didn't question it. He was busy, distracted, caught up in work and meetings and the comfortable rhythm of our life together. But then one evening, as I stood in the kitchen pretending to organize a drawer just to keep my hands busy, I felt his eyes on me. "You okay?" His voice was casual, but there was something behind it, something probing. I forced a smile, nodding quickly, too quickly. "Yeah. Just tired." He leaned against the counter, studying me for a moment longer than necessary, his gaze flicking over my face like he was trying to piece something together. I turned away before he could see too much. Before he could see the cracks forming beneath the surface. The night stretched on, long and restless. I busied myself with meaningless tasks, checking emails, folding laundry, anything to keep from thinking, from remembering. My husband fell asleep easily, his breathing even, steady, safe. But I lay awake, staring at the ceiling, feeling my skin buzz with an energy I couldn't shake. My phone vibrated on the nightstand. The sound sent a jolt through me, sharp and immediate, my heart slamming against my ribs as I reached for it. The screen glowed in the darkness, a single message waiting. "You want this too, don't you?" My fingers tightened around the phone. A slow, sharp inhale filled my lungs, but I didn't exhale right away. My mind screamed at me to delete it, to block him, to stop whatever this was before it spiraled further out of control. But my body had a different reaction. My pulse spiked, my throat went dry, a quiet shiver ran through me. I hovered over the screen, my thoughts a chaotic mess of guilt and something else, something dangerous. I deleted the message, but my hand was shaking. I placed the phone face down, pressing it against the mattress like that could somehow erase the weight of the words still burning behind my eyes. My husband shifted beside me, murmuring something in his sleep, oblivious to the war raging inside my head. I turned onto my side, squeezing my eyes shut, willing myself to forget. But I already knew the truth. There was no forgetting. No undoing. The boundaries weren't just blurring anymore. They were disappearing completely. The kitchen was filled with warm light, the table set with the good dishes we only used on special occasions. The scent of roasted garlic and fresh herbs hung in the air, mingling with the soft flicker of candlelight that danced across the room. I moved with purpose, adjusting the plates, straightening the silverware, pouring the wine with a steady hand. This was what we needed, what I needed. A night to remind us who we were, to ground me back in the life I'd built, the life I was supposed to want. My husband walked in, his tie loosened, eyes weary from a long day at work. His surprise was evident, his expression shifting from tired to curious as he took in the scene. "What's all this?" he asked, a smile flickering at the corner of his mouth. "Just thought we deserved a nice evening," I said, forcing a lightness into my voice that I didn't feel. He stepped closer, brushing a kiss against my cheek, the familiar warmth of his presence settling over me like a blanket. We sat down, the conversation easy, familiar, filled with the mundane details of our day. I laughed at his jokes, leaned in when he spoke, poured him another glass of wine, trying to forget the way my heart still raced with the memory of another kiss, another touch that I couldn't erase. But the harder I tried, the more it lingered, an unwelcome shadow that clung to the edges of my thoughts. After dinner, he reached for my hand, his thumb brushing over my knuckles in a gentle, affectionate gesture. "You've been distant lately," he said, his voice low, tinged with concern. I looked away, guilt twisting in my stomach. "Just stressed," I murmured, avoiding his gaze. He squeezed my hand, his eyes searching mine with a tenderness that made my chest ache. "I miss you," he whispered, his voice rough with sincerity. The words hit me harder than I expected, a sudden wave of emotion catching me off guard. I nodded, swallowing back the tightness in my throat. "I'm here," I said, though the words felt hollow, like an echo of something I used to mean. He leaned in, his lips brushing against mine, gentle at first, testing. I kissed him back, trying to lose myself in the familiar rhythm, the way his hand slid to the small of my back, pulling me closer. But instead of warmth, all I felt was a cold emptiness, a hollow ache that grew with every second. I wanted to feel something, anything, but the spark that once ignited between us was gone, replaced by a numbness I couldn't shake. He deepened the kiss, his touch firm, his breath warm against my skin, but it only heightened the sense of disconnection. I pulled back, forcing a smile I didn't feel. "Let's take it slow," I whispered, my voice shaky. He nodded, his expression softening with understanding. We settled into bed, his arm draped over me, his breathing evening out as sleep claimed him. But I lay awake, staring into the darkness, the weight of my own guilt pressing down on me like a physical burden. The room was silent, save for the steady rise and fall of his chest, the ticking of the clock in the hallway. I told myself this was what I wanted, what I needed. A normal life with a man who loved me, who had always been there. But the empty space inside me felt unbearable, a gnawing void that I couldn't fill. My phone vibrated on the nightstand, the sudden sound jolting me from the half-sleep I'd fallen into. My heart thudded painfully in my chest as I reached for it, my fingers trembling. The screen glowed with a new message, the words stark against the darkness. "Your husband doesn't need you." The air left my lungs in a rush, my pulse roaring in my ears. I stared at the message, my mind spinning, the lines between right and wrong blurring even further. My hand hovered over the screen, the urge to respond warring with the fear that this was spiraling out of control. I deleted the message, but it didn't matter. The damage had already been done. The rain drummed lightly against the windshield, a steady rhythm that filled the silence between us, the kind of silence that felt alive, thrumming with something neither of us was ready to name. The parking lot was nearly empty, just a few scattered cars under the dim glow of flickering streetlights. But it could have been full, it could have been the middle of the day, and it wouldn't have mattered. Everything outside this car ceased to exist the moment I got in. I told myself I wasn't going to come. I had ignored the message at first, let my phone vibrate against the nightstand, forced myself to close my eyes and pretend that I was stronger than this. But an hour later I was in my car, my hands gripping the steering wheel too tight, my breath uneven as I followed the route that had already been etched into my mind. Now I sat there, my heart pounding, my fingers curled into my lap, the air between us thick enough to suffocate. He was watching me, his gaze heavy, unreadable, waiting for me to speak first, to acknowledge why we were here, why I had come when I knew I shouldn't. I opened my mouth, but the words wouldn't come. My thoughts tangled, too messy, too dangerous to say out loud. His hand was on the gear shift, relaxed, his fingers tapping idly against the leather, but there was nothing casual about the way his body was angled toward me, the way his knee almost touched mine, the way the space between us felt too small for something that wasn't supposed to be happening. "You were supposed to ignore me," he finally said, his voice low, steady, almost amused, but there was something underneath it, something raw, something sharp. I exhaled slowly, pressing my nails into my palm, willing myself to feel anything other than the pull tightening in my chest. I tried. My voice was barely above a whisper, and I hated how unsteady it sounded, how much truth bled through those two words. His lips twitched just slightly, not quite a smile, not quite anything, just a flicker of acknowledgement. The rain intensified, blurring the world outside, turning the glow of the streetlights into streaks of yellow and white. I should have left. I should have opened the door, stepped out, walked away before the inevitable happened. But I didn't move. And then his hand was on my knee. Light at first, a test, a question without words, waiting for me to answer in the only way that mattered. I could have pulled away. I could have shoved his hand off, turned my face, drawn the line we both knew had already disappeared. But I didn't. His fingers pressed slightly harder, just enough for my breath to hitch, just enough to send a shiver through my body that had nothing to do with the cold. My skin burned under his touch, every nerve alight, every rational thought crumbling to dust. This wasn't just wrong. It was dangerous, a free fall off a ledge I had been standing on for far too long. "Tell me to stop," he murmured, his voice closer now, the heat of it against my cheek, his breath laced with something that matched the fire unraveling inside me. My pulse roared, my lungs ached from holding too much air, from not breathing at all. My lips parted, but nothing came out, no protest, no resistance, no denial. His fingers traced a slow path down, a deliberate, torturous movement, sending a violent tremor up my spine. Every logical part of me screamed to end this before it was too late. But it was already too late. I turned my head just enough to meet his eyes, and that was it, the last fraying thread snapping beneath the weight of something I couldn't control. His hand lingered, waiting, expecting, but neither of us moved, neither of us closed the distance, neither of us gave in fully. Not yet. Not tonight. But we both knew, this wasn't an ending. It was a beginning, and there was no coming back from it. The shift was subtle at first, small things that I told myself meant nothing, but I could feel it, a slow unraveling, a weight pressing down on the walls of the life I had spent years carefully constructing. My husband had always trusted me. He never questioned where I went, never asked who I was texting, never looked over my shoulder when my phone lit up. But something had changed. He was watching me now, not in a way that was obvious, not in a way that I could call him out on, but it was there, a quiet, lingering presence, an awareness that hadn't existed before. I caught him looking at me in the mornings when I left my phone face down on the table instead of next to my plate. I felt his eyes on me at night when I turned my body away in bed, holding the device closer than I should have. I knew he noticed the way I took it with me everywhere now, even to the bathroom, a habit I had never had before, a habit I couldn't break. I told myself he wasn't suspicious, that it was just my own paranoia twisting things in my head, but then I saw it. The flicker of something dark in his gaze when I grabbed my phone a little too fast, the tension in his jaw when I silenced a notification before he could hear it. He knew something was wrong. He just didn't know what. Not yet. But then one mistake. One moment of carelessness. I had left my phone unlocked, just for a second, just long enough for him to glance at the screen as I walked away. When I turned back, I saw it. The way his shoulders stiffened. The way his fingers clenched against the countertop. The way his entire body went unnaturally still, like something inside him had snapped into place. My stomach dropped, a slow, sickening weight settling deep in my gut. I didn't have to look to know what he had seen. Just two words. Waiting for you. My pulse roared in my ears, my vision narrowing as I forced myself to keep moving, to act like I hadn't noticed, like nothing had happened, like the world hadn't just tilted beneath my feet. He didn't say anything. He didn't ask, didn't demand an explanation, didn't confront me with anger or accusations. He just set his coffee cup down with slow, deliberate precision and walked away. The silence was worse than yelling. The silence was suffocating. The rest of the day passed in a haze, every second stretched too thin, every interaction laced with an undercurrent of tension that neither of us acknowledged. He didn't look at me the same way. And I knew without a doubt that he had read those words more than once, turning them over in his mind, dissecting every possible meaning. That night, long after dinner, long after the house had settled into stillness, he grabbed his keys. "I need to run out for a bit," he said too casually, his voice smooth, too smooth. My heart slammed against my ribs. At this hour? The question came out too quickly, too defensive, too obvious. He shrugged, pulling on his jacket, his fingers steady in a way that made my skin crawl. "Work thing." Pause. A flicker of something unreadable in his expression. "Don't wait up." The door shut behind him and I stood frozen, my breath trapped in my lungs, my hands cold despite the warmth of the house. Something wasn't right. Something had shifted. And for the first time, real fear curled in my stomach. I didn't know where he was going. But deep down I knew what he was doing. He was following me. The air inside the apartment was thick, heavy with something unspoken, something inevitable, something neither of us had the strength to fight anymore. The moment the door closed behind me, sealing us inside, I felt it shift, the last remnants of restraint unraveling, the weight of every stolen glance, every unspoken thought, every moment we had ignored crashing down all at once. I didn't hesitate this time. I didn't pretend. His hands were on me before I could think, before I could second-guess, before I could remember all the reasons this was wrong. My back hit the wall, my breath stolen from my lungs as his fingers traced fire along my skin, as his mouth found mine with the kind of urgency that had been simmering beneath the surface for far too long. There was no hesitation now, no slow build, no restraint. Just need, raw and unfiltered, crashing between us with the force of something long denied. My body responded before my mind could catch up, before the voice in the back of my head could remind me that there was no undoing this, no erasing, no taking it back. His hands gripped my waist, pulled me closer, every inch of space disappearing between us as I lost myself in the sensation, in the heat, in the way nothing else mattered in that moment but this. Somewhere in the distance, a door creaked. A soft sound, barely there, almost drowned out by the blood roaring in my ears, by the hammering of my pulse, by the gasps slipping past my lips. But it was enough. Just enough. A shift in the air. A presence. And then I felt it. That sinking, stomach-twisting awareness that something was wrong. That we were not alone. My breath caught, my body stiffened, my fingers digging into his shoulders as something colder than fear slid down my spine. Slowly, too slowly, I turned my head, my pulse a violent drum against my ribs. The door stood open. My husband stood in the frame. He didn't move. He didn't speak. He just watched. His face was unreadable, blank in a way that made my insides twist, his eyes locked on me, on us, taking in every detail, every incriminating inch of space between our bodies, every breath still caught in my throat. The silence was unbearable. My foster brother froze against me, his muscles tensed beneath my fingers, his breath still uneven, his body still pressed too close. For one agonizing moment, none of us moved. None of us spoke. The weight of it crushed down, suffocating, irreversible. And then my husband did something I didn't expect. He tilted his head slightly, his expression eerily calm, his voice steady, void of emotion. "Continue." One word. Just one. But it shattered everything. My stomach twisted so violently I thought I might be sick, my vision tunneling, my throat locking around the air. I couldn't seem to breathe. I wanted to speak, wanted to explain, wanted to find something, anything that could fix this, but there was nothing left to say. It was already too late. The silence stretched, thick and suffocating as I searched his face for something. Anger, pain, betrayal. But there was nothing. Nothing except quiet, devastating finality. My hands trembled. My lips parted but no sound came out. My husband didn't move. My foster brother didn't move. And in that moment I knew. The choice had already been made. And there was no way back.